Let's talk about OAuth 2 protocol, and let's go through a simple server implementation example so we can gain a good understanding what OAuth 2 is all about. Let's say your API needs to follow this protocol and you want to get familiar with setup required, as well as see how the communication between a client and a server takes place. In these steps, I hope we learn if OAuth 2 is a good fit for your next project. Let's begin. On the screen, we have two windows. Our browser acts as a client and terminal screen on the right acts as a server. I've just started my OAuth 2 server in the right window, and we can now enter URL in the browser to open an example endpoint behind OAuth 2 protocol. As you can see, I have no access to that endpoint by simply entering URL. Each request to OAuth 2 server has to contain a special authorization header. When I add that header with my custom header modifier and refresh the page, my server does do validation and lets me see the successful response. We've just seen a typical communication between client and a server. In our case, client was a browser, but more often communication happens between two APIs. You're also probably wondering how to obtain access token, which is going to be shown later in the video. In the next section, I want to show an example of server implementation and all requirements involved in OAuth 2 protocol. This is going to be based on PHP, but other programming languages have to conform to similar structures. I'm going to list all steps we're going to go through, so let's build OAuth 2 server together and understand exactly what's happening behind the scenes. In this project, I've already installed the most basic Symfony version. First, we need to install bundle responsible for OAuth 2 server. We execute command, and after Composer is finishing installation, we are given initial steps to do from their documentation. One of the first steps is to generate private and public keys. Then we need to make sure we have a connection with our database. Database is required to store information about clients' credentials, as well as information about access tokens. More on that in just a moment. Let's update my environment variable so that it points to an empty database in MySQL. I can now execute command to update database schema so that we create new tables in previously empty database. We can now create a new controller, which is going to be our example endpoint behind OAuth 2. I'm creating an API/example endpoint with its granted attribute, which is making sure that the response is going to be only shown to the authenticated users with at least edit scope. We are almost ready to test our controller, but first we need to make sure our public and private keys are in the right place according to environment variables. And then we need to make sure our endpoint and obtaining access tokens are behind firewall inside security YAML. Let's start serving traffic to our server by running a command Symfony server start. It's a good practice to check now and then what we've done so far goes without any surprises, because those are harder to fix later. When we open the page, we expect to see an unauthorized message because we have not created any client's credentials yet. Let's do that now and run a command OAuth 2 server create client. First parameter is name, then identifier, as well as we need to provide grant type with scopes as seen on the screen. Our focus today is client credentials grant type only. I've just realized we have to remove main firewall in order to make sure OAuth 2 is taking over our authentication across the project. Then let's validate also scopes in our configuration file because we've just created a client who meant to have access to edit scope, which has to be in that list. It's time to generate our first access token using credentials we've just generated. We can also access that information from our database where each new client is saved. In order to get access token, we have to call token endpoint, where we provide information such as grant type, client ID, client secret, and scope. Now that we have access token, we can call our example endpoint, which is behind OAuth 2, and this time we get a successful response. As you can see, it doesn't take up much time to create your own OAuth 2 server. There are also multiple configuration options. You can, for example, create your own grant type, which then can be adjusted to your authentication requirements. I hope you've learned something new today. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.